Did you know that there was a backup plan if Japan didn't surrender following the use of atomic bombs? From 1939 until 1945, World War II was a major conflict that saw the alliance of the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain fighting Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan. The fighting took place in Europe, Asia, and Africa. It was a war that claimed the lives of some 40 to 70 million people. The two main theaters in the war were the European theater and the Pacific theater. The plan for the Allies in Europe would be to put Germany in a situation where they would have to fight a war on two fronts. The Soviets would attack from the east while the United States and Great Britain would advance from the west and south. The Pacific theater was more difficult. The vast Pacific Ocean was a huge obstacle for the Allies, plus the Japanese had strategic island posts in the Pacific. The plan was to go on an island hopping campaign to push the Japanese back to Japan. The Allies could use the island for bombing missions. Japan had success early, but the tide changed when the Allies took a major victory in 1942 at Midway Island. From there, the Allies made progress. It was slow, but they were putting the Japanese on the defensive. 1945. It was 1945 when the Allies had secured major victories in the Atlantic, Europe, Africa, and the Pacific against Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan. The Allies were ready for victory, but they weren't sure when it would arrive. Nazi Germany surrendered to the Allies on May 8, 1945, while Italy had surrendered on September 8, 1943. Japan was the lone nation left in their alliance. The United States and their allies had made major advancements in the Pacific. They were still on their island-hopping mission that had them closer to Japan and had strategic holds on islands to successfully complete bombing missions of important Japanese cities. The Japanese continued to fight from a defensive standpoint. By May 1945, the United States had scheduled November 1, 1945 as the date they would invade Japan. The Japanese had some 4 million men in their military ready to fight to the death. It would be another D-Day type of mission for the US, and it would be a massive undertaking by the United States military and their allies. Estimates had the casualties for the US military easily at 1 million. Some estimates had the total deaths on both sides at 10 million, which was beyond shocking. They knew Japan was willing to fight to the death, and an invasion of Japan may have lasted for 1 year or longer. What was fascinating about Japan was that they hadn't been successfully invaded in some 2,000 years. The Mongols attempted to invade Japan twice during the 13th century but failed miserably. Typhoons damaged their ships and killed many Mongols. Had the US attempted their invasion of Japan, they too would have run into typhoon season. Who knows what impact it would have had on the mission had it been ordered. United States and British naval vessels could have been destroyed by the typhoons, and many lives would have been lost. The invasion of Japan was referred to as Operation Downfall. The operation would be lengthy and costly, especially in human lives. The US lost many soldiers at key Pacific battles like Guadalcanal, Okinawa, and Iwo Jima. The American public was getting tired of the war continuing on, and they were hoping for a quick victory against the Japanese. There had to be another way, a quick way to end the war with the Japanese. It was July 1945 when the atomic bomb was successfully tested in New Mexico. President Harry Truman authorized the use of the atomic bomb not long after the test. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima in Japan. The next day, something incredible happened. While World War II raged on, President of the United States Franklin Roosevelt had met with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. Before Roosevelt died, the three leaders met in Yalta in modern-day Ukraine. One of the topics of discussion was the Soviet Union joining the war in the Pacific. Roosevelt and Churchill made an agreement with Stalin that if the Soviet Union joined the fighting, they would be given a sphere of influence in Manchuria, an important region in China. Also, the Soviets would have the southern portion of Sakhalin, an island north of Japan. The deal also involved the fate of Eastern Europe and the development of the Security Council for the United Nations. The Soviet Union weighed the options while the United States and Britain waited for a response. This deal was agreed upon, and Stalin promised that the Russian military would join in the fight against the Japanese. Russia would enter World War II against the Japanese on August 8, 1945. Stalin wanted to be sure that the Soviet Union would be the country with the greatest influence on Eastern Asia following World War II. His sights were set on China, and he knew other countries would embrace the communist form of government of the Soviet Union. He was also aware of the atomic bomb program the United States was developing thanks to his spies. He too wanted a weapon like that. Stalin needed Japan out of the way to conquer East Asia. This is not the first time these nations had faced each other in combat. The Soviet Union had something of a score to settle with the Japanese. The Soviet Union and Japan, 1904 to 1939. Japan and Russia fought in the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 until 1905. The causes of this war were due to both countries trying to be major power players in East Asia. Both countries wanted control of Manchuria and Korea. Manchuria was a coal-rich region, and the peninsula of Korea also served as a great strategic location. The Japanese Navy stunned the Russian Navy in a surprise attack. The Russians regrouped but couldn't take down the Japanese Navy. Japanese troops landed in Korea and they advanced towards Russia, where the Russian army was handed a tough defeat. Japan walked away from the war as an emerging power in East Asia, and Russia was humiliated. This victory gave the Japanese the confidence to be the major power of East Asia. For many years, China had been the major power in East Asia, but they were struggling as a nation. A new contender was about to take East Asia by storm. Korea was invaded by Japan in 1910, and in 1931 they invaded Manchuria. Both occupations were brutal, and the Japanese were ruthless overlords. Within 6 years, Japan had gained control over most of China. China was experiencing a power struggle between the communists under Mao Zedong and a pro-Western government under Chiang Kai-shek. A civil war between Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek was something the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union did not want. They knew if the country was at war, then they might not be unified against Japan. They also knew Japan would greatly benefit from the Chinese fighting each other. The Soviet Union had their eyes on Japan in the 1930s as they began their domination of Eastern Asia. Stalin didn't like Japan so close to his borders, so he ordered his military to Manchuria in 1938. If Stalin wanted to control Eastern Asia, then he wanted the Japanese to be obliterated. This was his big chance. Japan took notice of these Soviet movements toward China, but they underestimated Stalin and his military. The Japanese remembered their relatively easy victory in the Russo-Japanese War. Plus, it was no secret that Joseph Stalin had killed some of his top military leaders in a paranoid purge. The Japanese believed the best and brightest in the Soviet military were killed in the purge. They were wrong. Both sides prepared themselves for war in Manchuria. The Emperor of Japan didn't make any official announcement for the Japanese to attack the Soviets, but a Japanese commander did launch an attack at Lake Khasan, located at the border that divides the Soviet Union and China. The end result was a shocking loss for the Japanese, but it was not the end of the fighting between the two nations. Fighting would go into 1939, and some 18,000 to 23,000 Japanese troops were killed. The Soviet Union and Japan ended up making a non-aggression pact in 1941. It was not a permanent act, but one that would end around 1946 or 1947. Years earlier, Germany and the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact. Germany did not adhere to that pact, and they ended up invading the Soviet Union. After pressure from the United States and Britain to join the fighting, the Soviet Union agreed. Their involvement's not always discussed and has been referred to by some World War II historians as Operation August Storm. Are you enjoying this video? Be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Also, hit the notification bell to get updates on new videos. Operation August Storm. There were an estimated 700,000 Japanese troops in Manchuria in August 1945. There were plans by the Japanese to bring in an additional 250,000 troops to aid with the defense of the region. Also, there were thousands of Japanese settlers in Manchuria who could be called up to aid the military if needed. The Soviets invaded with over 1 million troops. Stalin had begun moving his troops towards the east earlier in the year from Europe, once Germany had been defeated. The Soviets had more tanks and artillery in the area. The Soviet tanks were also reportedly better armored than the Japanese. Finally, the Soviets had a major advantage on the number of aircraft, with a 2-to-1 advantage. Speed, surprise, and mobility were the keys to success for Operation August Storm. The Soviets had the edge in tanks, so they would be sent in to lead the attacks and inflict massive damage. From there, the infantry would move in with air support. The way the attack was designed was to prevent the Japanese from bringing in reinforcements. Also, the Soviet Navy had some successful amphibious landings in Korea. They provided much-needed assistance in the fighting by bombing the region and landing their troops. The Japanese were taken by surprise because the Soviets moved quickly into Manchuria and they breached areas the Japanese felt were impassable. Also, the Japanese believed that the Soviets would attack in September or October. There were communication issues for the Japanese military in Manchuria. Also, some of their top officials were away for meetings when the fighting began. Their expertise was needed. The feared kamikaze pilots were brought in, but they weren't a difference maker in the fighting with the Soviets. In the end, the August attack by the Soviet Union was not only a shock but a demoralizing loss for the Japanese. The only issue for the Soviets at times was the rugged terrain of Manchuria. It made transportation difficult at times, but they managed. Both sides experienced fuel shortages, which was frustrating. Despite these issues, the fighting continued. The Japanese soldiers in Manchuria were surprised to learn that their government had surrendered in August 1945 following the use of atomic bombs. It was a massive blow, but the Soviets continued to fight. As they made their way into Manchuria, they made a horrific discovery. The Soviets came across what appeared to be a lumber mill, but it was something called Unit 731. It was a laboratory that conducted some of the most inhumane experiments on human beings. Some of the experiments carried out are too graphic to tell. Basically, the Japanese set up a lab where people were turned into guinea pigs. Chinese citizens and prisoners of war were injected with diseases and subjected to horrible experiments. The details of Operation August Storm are a bit murky to this day. The Soviets claim to have killed 84,000, while the Japanese claim to have lost some 13,000 soldiers. Over 500,000 Japanese were captured after the fighting and were subjected to the brutal Soviet army. There's been a debate for many years regarding the use of atomic weapons to end the war in Japan. While they did bring the war to an end, there was the overwhelming destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Between 125,000 and 250,000 people died from the two bombs. The invasion of Manchuria by the Soviet Union put Japan in an awkward position. They were fighting the United States, British, and Russians on two fronts. Every last soldier and resource was used to defend Japan and to fight in Manchuria. In the end, the Japanese surrendered in mid-August 1945, with a treaty signed in September 1945. Once the treaty was signed, Japan and the Soviet Union took different paths. The Soviets gained a great deal in Eastern Asia due to the involvement. They were able to divide Korea and created a communist nation in North Korea. Stalin was also an ally to the Chinese Communists and Mao Zedong. China became a communist nation in 1949 and was aligned with the Soviets. The Soviets even took over Eastern Europe following World War II. Many countries became communist like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. What was a major aid for the United States and Britain was the beginning of the Cold War. Japan went through a rebuilding phase following World War II. Their military was dismantled, and to this day they have a ground self-defense force. There are currently 23 United States military bases in Japan. In 2016, Barack Obama became the first sitting United States president to visit Hiroshima. He placed a wreath at the memorial that honors those who died. Thanks for watching. What did you think about this video? Let us know in the comments below and remember to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.